Hello, and welcome to the LVP Architects podcast, where we're still talking about subjects to learn for your part 3. And today's podcast is on roles. So the key question is, do you know yours? It is important to know your role and appointment. And again, its associated responsibilities and to whom, along with the roles and responsibilities of others. So, it makes for a much more efficient design team. It's worth listing out for every procurement what roles there are available, and just to compare between which procurement route, whether the same roles are still there in different stages within the REBA Planner works. This will help you later on to answer the exam question so you're not tripped up. The roles don't necessarily change a lot. Their appointments might do, where and when. Some typical roles are obviously the client. So is it just a single client? Is it an experienced client? Is it a multi-headed client? So an example is a university, there will be a board that will be a multi-headed client. You have your client who might be inexperienced or might be really experienced. The quantity surveyor, QS, important role, not just about money really, though that's primarily why they're appointed, to help control cost and advise on costs. So, they have if they're good, they should have their fingers to the pulse. They know what costs can incur for what type project, if it's an office block, if it's a housing development, if it's a university building, there are different rates for those kind of buildings, and they'll be able to guide early on an approximation of X per metre squared of that type of building will be this roughly. And then as more detail is provided, then they begin their measurements and they'll say, you've got X amount of cladding, X amount of brickwork, X amount of internal walls of this and the other. So they'll help and contribute towards what's the best procurement path as well for that type. They may advise that actually for that sort of size, type of building, value, currently D&B is the way to go to get the best value. Their contribution is not to be knocked. Other roles are project manager. So project manager in larger scale projects are at the top, just below the client, and they will dictate, they will guide and push the project in the direction it needs to go. Principal designer, who is that? We've mentioned on a previous podcast of its importance and its role. So, the principal designer is by default the client until someone is appointed. They need to understand the building process, really. They're going to highlight risks and try and manage those risks and start their health and safety file. Obviously, another role, architect, should be aware of that. Planning officer, conservation officer, structural engineers, mechanical and electrical engineers, civil engineers, building control inspector or officer. So obviously there are private versions of these. Landscape architect, fire engineer, acoustic engineer, the main contractor themselves, the principal contractor, their version of the principal designer. So when they're appointed and they are in control of the site, they're responsible for all health and safety. So they have a principal contractor role within the main contractor who deals with all that. And then you have your subcontractors. Obviously, there are many more roles. So it's important to understand how does it work, who's appointed to who. So who does the client appoint? So in a traditional versus a design and build versus management, constructing, procurement routes. Get your head around where the contractual links are and the responsibilities. So I'd recommend for each procurement type, you kind of map out who's linked to who by contract and by liability, by communication as well. What you'll find is some clients in some contracts where they appoint a main contractor to do the works, who then appoint subcontractors. There's obviously the liability route is only between main contractor to client, and some clients and some contractors as well, they like to produce a third party warranty. So it's like a side contract between client and subcontractor. So what that means is should the main contractor go bust, or should something happen later on in the main contractor no longer exists, that subcontractor who did that bit of work that may be faulty now, the client has a legal route to get them to fix the problem or resolve the problem. Or if there's a dispute, they have a means to go through contractually. Obviously, if you get novated, if you're an architect and you get novated from client to contractor, your role and responsibilities may slightly change. Your liabilities will definitely change. Obviously, in the first instance, before you're novated, you're for the client, your responsibility is to the client. When you're novated, that link is broken, you now are contracted, and liabilities are to the main contractor. Also, you could diagram on their communication. If we take design and build again as an example, the communication route before novation is quite clear. The architects talk straight to the client, unless it's a huge project, in which case it might be via a project manager who would be at the top of that, just underneath the client in that diagram. Once you're novated, your communication route is through the main contractor to the client. And again, if it's a large project, it'll be through the main contractor via the project manager to the client. You're no longer got a link to the client. You have to follow the certain procedures. And again, the client wishes to communicate something to you, it has to go through the main contractor. So just be aware of that, and I would diagram them all just to get your head around it, so that when it comes to the exam, if in your case study you talk about, communication, there is something about the breakdown of it, or there was some issue that was a consequence of the procurement type, and you want to elaborate more on the contractual links or the communication links, these sort of diagrams that you could make are, visually they help. They're useful not only for your exam, but your case study. In your exam, it's all about having it fresh in your head, so you could draw something. We talk a little bit later in another podcast about the exam and sort of how to help you, because you've got limited time to answer those questions. Okay, I think we'll stop there. It's pretty much, that, like I say, there are many other roles. You just need to be aware of what they are, what's your link between them in terms of contractual communication liabilities for each procurement route. Okay, I think that's it for this podcast. In the next podcast, we'll talk a little bit about the site. Again, all of this is related to part 3, so it's information you glean from the questions. See you next podcast, where we'll talk a little bit about the site.